Follow along, Catholic Pilgrims, as we follow French Doctor of the Church, St. Francis de Sales, through his book, Introduction to the Devout Life. Tune in as we read through this practical guide for living out the Catholic faith well. Welcome back, Catholic Pilgrims. Oh, I love today's reading. It's so good and a fresh way to look at inspirations. Because it is a longer reading, I don't want to take too much time talking myself, so instead, let's just jump right in to chapter 18 of the second part. Chapter 18, How to Receive Inspirations. By inspirations, I mean all the affections, attractions, inward reproaches and regrets, perceptions and illuminations with which God moves us, working in our hearts through his fatherly love and care in order to awaken, to kindle, lead, and draw us to heavenly love and holy desires. In short, all that forwards our eternal welfare. These are the voice of the Beloved knocking at the door, speaking to the heart of his bride, wakening her when she sleeps, calling to her when she is absent, offering her the honey, the milk, and the fruits of his garden, filling her ears with the sound of his most sweet and lovely voice. To draw a comparison from our common life, before a marriage is arranged, first, the marriage proposal must be made to the bride. Secondly, she hearkens to the proposition. And thirdly, she gives her consent. So when God would work in us, by us, and with us some good work, he begins by suggesting it by his inspiration. Next, we receive the suggestion, and lastly, we consent to it. There are 3 steps downwards towards sin: temptation, delight, and consent. And in the same way, 3 steps upwards towards virtue: inspiration as opposed to temptation, pleasure in the inspiration as opposed to delight in temptation, and consent to inspiration as opposed to consent to temptation. Though the inspiration should continue during our whole life, it is of no avail unless we take delight in it, but rather we the more offend God, as did the Israelites with whom he strove for 40 years, seeking to convert them, whilst they hardened their hearts and would not hear, so that he swore in his wrath that they should not enter into his rest, just as one who has long loved a woman would feel injured if, after all, she were to set aside his attachment. It is a great step towards glorifying God when we delight in his inspirations, and in so doing we begin to please him. For although such delight falls short of entire consent, yet it shows an inclination to it. And just as it is a good sign when we take pleasure in hearing God's word, which may be called an outward inspiration, so is our delight in his inward inspirations a pleasing and acceptable thing in his sight. Of this kind of pleasure the spouse in the canticle said, "My soul melted when he, my beloved, spoke." And so an earthly lover is content when he sees that his love is esteemed and prized. But the perfection lies in consent. For if after receiving inspiration, and that gladly, we still refuse to consent to it, we greatly offend God and despise his goodness. So it was with the bride. For although the voice of her beloved had reached her heart, yet she delayed to open the door to him, offering an idle excuse, and so he withdrew himself and departed. And so an earthly lover, who had been received and encouraged, would feel more aggrieved if afterwards he was rejected than if he had never been encouraged at all. Resolve then gratefully to receive all God's inspirations, and make haste to receive them with reverence, as the ambassadors of the heavenly King, who would espouse you to himself. Hearken meekly to their words, cultivate the love you feel, and cherish the holy inspiration. Consent to it fully, lovingly, and ceaselessly, for then God, whom we cannot place under an obligation, will yet hold himself greatly obliged to your love. But before you act upon these inspirations in any important or unusual matters, take counsel of your spiritual guide, that he may judge whether your inspiration is true or false. For when the enemy sees a soul ready to consent to inspirations, he often seeks to deceive it, an evil which will never happen so long as you are obedient to your director in all humility. Having consented, be diligent to procure the fruits in good works, which are the crowning point of virtue. For consent in the heart producing no outward results is like a vine that bears no fruit. Your morning exercise, well performed, will greatly promote this, inasmuch as it leads you not only to general, but to specific good actions. I love how St. Francis shows that with both sin and virtue, there is a similar pattern followed. With sin, there is the temptation that we first receive, and with virtue, there is the inspiration. Then with sin, we take delight in it, and with virtue, we take pleasure in it. And then with both, there is the consent. However, as he says, quote, sin takes 3 steps downward, and virtue takes 3 steps upward, unquote. When I was in my last semester of my junior year in college, my husband, then my boyfriend, and I decided that it would be a good idea to live together our senior year. There was the temptation, and man, did it sound good. The idea of playing at marriage before marriage sounded so wonderful. We loved each other. We spent all our free time together anyway. Why not? My baby sister even tried to talk me out of it, and my parents were not thrilled, but we ignored their warnings. We took complete delight in the idea of living together before marriage, and so that delight, of course, led to our consent. And we obviously were not chaste, as I got pregnant with our oldest pretty soon after moving in together. Today, after being married for nearly 23 years, we tell everyone to wait to live together until you're married. We see the wisdom in what the church teaches about marriage, fornication, and cohabitation. And cohabitation stole from us the thrill of coming together for the first time as newlyweds. Our wedding day was still wonderful, but both of us agreed that the thrill and the joyous anticipation of coming home to our new home as husband and wife was not there for us. When I started this podcast, I was given the germ of an idea in my mind, I believe by God. I was sitting with St. Faustina's diary in my hand, wondering how to get through it, and the idea of a year-long podcast hit me, and I was intrigued. A little scared, but intrigued. And as I started to think about it, I took pleasure in the idea. I was intimidated, but it seemed like a thrilling challenge, and so I consented. Season 1 of my podcast, where I read through St. Faustina's diary, went off without a hitch, and I credit God for giving me all the graces I needed to make it through a every day for 1 year podcast. I've had so many people reach out to me to tell me that they finally made it through that book because of the help of my podcast, and that was my goal. I wanted to help others and myself get through a somewhat difficult book. I think the most important thing to remember from today's reading is when St. Francis says, quote, "Resolve then gratefully to receive all God's inspirations, and make haste to receive them with reverence as the ambassadors of the heavenly King, who would espouse you to himself." Unquote. If God has given you an inspiration, take pleasure that he found you worthy to take on such a noble task, and go ahead and consent to it. He will give you the graces to see it through. That is all for today, Catholic Pilgrims. Have a wonderful day, and until next time, live the faith boldly and travel well.